Hello, and welcome to Don't Shout at the Telly. I'm Fraser Myers, and today we'll be discussing post-referendum Britain. We're delighted to be joined by Brendan O'Neill, who is the editor of Spiked and a writer for The Spectator and The Telegraph. So without further ado, Brendan, over to you.
Thanks, Fraser. Well, in relation to Brexit, I would say that it is the best thing to happen in British politics in a generation. And I think that for two reasons. Firstly, because it really was a kind of revolt. You know, it might not have involved pitchforks or guns or weapons of any sort, but it was a revolt of the people against the establishment. Because if you think about how many sections of the establishment lined up behind the idea that we should stay in the EU, pretty much all of them, the whole business class, the capitalist elite, the political class, the cultural elite, celebrities, every member of the great and the good effectively said, we must stay in the EU, please vote Remain. And yet a majority of people, 17.4 million, voted Leave. So it was a real act of rebellion in that sense, in the sense that the people said, we are not going to go along with your plan, with your suggestion that this is the only way politics can be, with the thing that you think is best for the country. We're going to go with something else. It was a pretty refreshing, revolting act by ordinary people. So that was really positive. And then the second reason I think it was a good thing is because it's really blown the lid off politics in general, and even of history, I would say. Because the whole point of technocracy, and the EU is symbolises technocracy in its most extreme form, it's about suppressing politics and conflict and tensions within society and wishing them away by making all aspects of politics very technocratic and bureaucratic and free of controversy. So the EU is really the most vivid symbol, in a way, of the unwillingness of our political leaders to talk about actual politics and instead just to manage society. And what I think people who voted Brexit were really saying was, well, we want to talk about politics. We want these issues to come back to the surface of society. So I think it's kind of unfrozen history in a way. It's brought history back to life. And we've seen that right away because questions about sovereignty and democracy and class and power have very quickly come back into public life. So for those two reasons, firstly because it was obviously a rebellion against the advice of our betters, and secondly because it really says that there is something better and different to technocracy. For those two reasons, I think Brexit is the best thing to happen to British politics in ages.
I'd like to think that democracy does exist, but the Brexit vote has shown that it doesn't look like there's any democracy because the elite themselves, they want to push us down. Anybody who voted the opposite way to their view, they think that we should be quietened down, and I think that is a wrong sort of thinking.
How can we make sure that we don't lose this vote and that we can actually, get together in communities and society and fight for democracy and make sure that we don't let the political elite take it away from us?
What would be the implications of delaying invoking Article 50 and dragging this out, and its implications for our democratic society?
You mentioned that class have been brought to the fore again, and I kind of wanted to ask, lots of people are talking about class, but are people seeing class in a political way? Are the working class once again potentially a force for political change? Or is this just more of a sociological discussion about C1s and Ds and Es, things like that?
Well, I think in relation to the question of democracy, I think it's absolutely true that this has exposed the fragility of democracy and how weak the establishment's attachment is to the idea of democracy and how quickly they have been willing to say, well, maybe democracy is a bad idea. And even I have been writing about elitism and criticising elitism for a long time, but even I was taken aback by the strength of opinion and by the utter snobbery and illiberalism of what was said in response to the Brexit vote. You had politicians saying, we should have a second referendum. People didn't know what they were doing. They were hoodwinked. They were, brainwashed by demagogues. You had journalists saying, well, maybe democracy has passed its sell-by date. Maybe having the people decide on important issues is not a good idea. There was this real outpouring of almost kind of 19th century elitism, it really brought back to mind the kind of discussions that were had in the 1830s and the 1840s when the Chartists, a working class movement for male suffrage, were arguing for democracy, and people said to them, well, no, you can't have democracy because poor people are easily won over by demagogues, they're easily brainwashed, they can't be trusted on important issues. All those arguments have come back into play. So I think the key thing for people to do after this vote is to really stand up for democracy and to defend it all over again. That battle hasn't been won. That's what has been revealed to us most clearly. So we have to keep having that battle all over again. And I think this is where Article 50 comes into it. I think people underestimate the importance of invoking Article 50. It's not simply a technical thing. I mean, that's the article in the European Constitution or the Lisbon Treaty that allows a nation state to leave the European Union. But the reason that the establishment in Britain and in Brussels are so reluctant to allow us to invoke Article 50 is because they know that that is the next step in making the people's will a reality. And they will do everything within their power not to make our will a reality because they don't like the choice that we made. So there's a very clear effort to kick it into the long grass, to dilute it, to weaken it, to water it down. And you might eventually get to a point where they have some kind of negotiated deal where we kind of leave the EU, but we kind of don't. And that's not what the people wanted. So that will also be anti-democratic. In relation to the class thing, I think it's not the return of class in the way it existed for the past 100 or 150 years, in the sense of a kind of radical working class being confident of itself and taking on the ruling class in that kind of slightly old-fashioned way that we saw in the 19th century and the early 20th century. It's something slightly different, which is that there are huge sections of Britain who tend to be the working class and the poor, who feel extremely alienated from the political establishment for very good reason, because the political establishment treats them like crap. Not only does it not engage with them or listen to them, it actively treats them like idiots, as unhealthy, ignorant, stupid people, bad parents who need to be corrected and re-educated and looked after and made less racist. I mean, these are the patronising initiatives we've seen coming from government in recent years. And I think what's happened is that those sections of society seized this opportunity to strike back against an elite that obviously doesn't like them. This was different to a general election. In a general election, you can only choose between parties that are actually quite similar. But in this referendum, the whole establishment was on its knees begging us to do what they wanted us to do. And people spied an opportunity to give them a black eye. They said, right, the whole establishment wants us to do this. It must be really important to them. Therefore, we're not going to do it. So it was a real act of rebellion by sections of society that feel completely neglected, rather than being a kind of traditional working class revolt in the old-fashioned sense.
I'm really optimistic to see that the British people have voted to leave the EU, but I'm also reluctant to invoke Article 50 right now, because I think that Britain is too important of a nation with like very close connections with like other EU states to make a choice to like make a movement like that right now, especially considering like just right beside Britain we have Ireland, and there's no like physical border that like separates Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So a lot of people are going to be left in the dark when it comes to travelling from, let's say, the northwest to the northeast. And like England obviously has the Eurotrain connection to France as well.
So it seems to me that the Brexit vote might actually not happen. With kind of every passing day, there seem to be more attacks on it. Where does that leave society? If it doesn't happen, or if it's watered down in such a way that it's barely Brexit at all, where does that leave our society as a democratic nation?
I totally agree with that. I think that Britain has spoken, they've said what they want. There's no need to backtrack. And to imply in any way that they didn't know, Britain didn't know, it was a moment of madness, you know, we didn't know what we were doing, is an insult, complete insult. And I think that no delay should happen.
I'm confused why after the vote, I mean definitely people have their specific reasons to whether they want to remain or leave. Why don't they accept the vote and focus on the positive? Like, this is a golden opportunity for Britain now to move out of the EU and do trade with the rest of the world, I don't know, work with the rest of the nations other than EU, along with EU nations. So why are they still hung up about, okay, we are so I don't know, fortress-like, and we love that fortress of the EU?
Well, I think that's a really important question, is the question of why, firstly, I always ask myself, why did people vote Remain? I find that very difficult to understand why you would vote for something as undemocratic and cruel, actually, as the European Union, which pummeled Greece and plunged huge numbers of Greek people into poverty, which installed an unelected government in Italy, which forced the Irish people to vote again and again on the Lisbon Treaty until they gave the right answer, which treats Eastern Europe as just this kind of morass of prejudiced, ignorant people who need to be re-educated all the time. It's an extremely elitist, illiberal, neoliberal, in the sense of being very pro-capitalist institution. So I find I'm bamboozled as to why so many lefties and so-called liberals are so in favour of the European Union. And I think it does come down to a kind of politics of fear. And this is the great irony, which is that they will often accuse Brexiteers of falling for the politics of fear, like the politics of xenophobia and so on, when in fact, that's a tiny, small element of the Brexit camp. And I think actually the Brexiteers tend to be quite optimistic and positive. And if you speak to ordinary working class people who voted Leave, they're actually quite positive about the future and the possibilities that now exist for Britain in terms of trade and a new kind of politics and so on. It's the Remainers who are still crying and sobbing and feeling sorry for themselves and panicking about the world falling apart and Britain becoming a racist hellhole post-Brexit and everyone going crazy. It's they who are behaving in a slightly unhinged way and a very fearful way. So I think they were attached to the EU because it was familiar, it was the status quo, it felt safe, it suppressed tensions and politics in Europe, and they liked that. But tough luck, there was more people who didn't like it. And in a democracy, the majority wins, so I'm very happy about that. I think in relation to Article 50, I think it's really important that we invoke it now, actually, because I think all the delays are really about saying, well, you've had your say, we actually think you were wrong, but we will acknowledge your say, but in our own way. This is what the elite is now saying. We will let it play out in a way that we think is sensible. So we'll have all our negotiations, we'll work out our deals, we'll talk to all the big guys in Brussels, we'll work out what's in our best interests, and then we'll act on your say. That's not good enough from my point of view. And I think actually, even from the point of view of Britain working out a good deal, it doesn't even work from that point of view, because if you go into the negotiations in the EU saying, we're not going to invoke it yet, we're playing it safe, you're really going on the back foot. You're going in a defensive position. So even from the point of view of negotiations, it doesn't make sense. In relation to Ireland and its borders, well, firstly, I don't think there should be a border between the Republic of Ireland and the North of Ireland. But more importantly, I think the Irish people should be given the opportunity to leave the European Union, because they don't like it either. And that's made clear from their vote against the Nice Treaty in 2001, their vote against the Lisbon Treaty, which they were forced to vote again under huge economic blackmail and threats from the European Union. So my solution to the so-called British-Irish problem that's been thrown up by Brexit, as everyone keeps telling us, is to invite the Irish people also to leave the European Union. So I think we should be agitating for Ireland to follow us into the brand new world of a new internationalism, a post-EU moment, a chance for a new kind of democracy and a new kind of a new global outlook, actually.
I found it interesting you talked about like racial disparities and who voted, but what I found pertinent amongst my age people is that loads of them voted Remain, especially in my school. I run a debate society, and we had a debate, and I was expecting intersections between different beliefs, but everyone bar one person was voting Remain, and even if they can't vote, they were rallying for Remain as the vote. What would you see as an explanation for why there's a disparity in who voted for Leave and Remain in different ages and different age groups?
You talk about optimism and hope moving forward, but there are millions of people that didn't get their own way. How do we get everyone on the same side as a country moving forward? I'm interested to know what that looks like to you.
A few people have been comparing the Brexit vote to the rise of Donald Trump and the new politics that might be emerging over in the US. Now, to me, that kind of seems, instinctively I feel that that's a kind of slur against the Brexit vote, because I certainly wouldn't vote for Donald Trump, whereas I was very proud to vote for Brexit and very excited by it. But is there any truth in those comparisons that's that's worth rescuing?
No, I think I'm really against. I've noticed a lot of this in the commentary, including among people who are actually sympathetic to Brexit, or who are Brexiteers. They will say that Brexit is like the Trump phenomenon in the sense that it's a kind of neglected or alienated section of society going for a politics that is different and new and strange and unpredictable. I don't think there's any comparison between Brexit and Trump for numerous reasons. Firstly, Brexit was not a vote for any individual. All those people who say it's a vote for Farage or it's a vote for Boris Johnson, it's not true at all. 17.4 million people voted for Brexit. At the last general election, fewer than 4 million people voted for UKIP, which is a high number, but it's not as many as voted for Brexit. People say, oh, they all voted this way because of the Daily Mail. Hardly anyone reads the Daily Mail in the scheme of things. I know everyone hates it, but hardly anyone reads it in the scheme of things. Certainly not anywhere near 17.4 million people. So they're not voting for an individual in the way that the people who are falling behind Trump are doing. So that's one important difference. Also, I think the Trump phenomenon is largely about avoiding allowing public life to come back into play. It's a reluctance to grapple with the problem of politics in favour of saying, well, this one guy, this one funny, un-PC, ridiculous individual might just stir things up. So there's an element of demagoguery, certainly on his part, whereas Brexit was much more about having an honest confrontation with the decline of public life. It was about having an open, democratic, liberal reckoning with the way in which politics has gone over the past few decades. So it was a much more honest and refreshing thing than the Trump phenomenon is. So I think there's no comparison at all, and I think anytime you hear that, you must shout it down. It's just not true. I think in relation to the generations, it's a really interesting phenomenon where young people were far more likely to vote in favour of the EU and old people were far more likely to vote against it, which has given rise to a lot of generational conflict, which basically means that lots of young people are marching in the streets and being extremely rude about old people. I think it's partly because young people think the EU is Europe. It's the only thing they've known in relation to Europe. So they think the EU is the continent of Europe. And one of the arguments I've been making is the EU is not Europe. Firstly, it doesn't cover the whole of Europe. Secondly, it's not a union of European peoples. It's a union of European elites. It's a union of professional politicians and NGOs and lawyers and academics. These are not ordinary people. And in fact, I would argue that the EU divides Europe in new ways. It divides between the civilized west of Europe, which apparently must always lecture the uncivilized east of Europe. It divides the industrial, hard-working north from the supposedly lazy south. That's the new prejudice we've been given in relation to Italy and Greece and so on. It's created all these new divides, actually, the EU. So it doesn't bring Europe together at all. So it's not Europe. It's just a gang of elites doing politics behind closed doors. But to a lot of young people who've grown up only knowing the EU, they think it's Europe. Older people have a much more sceptical point of view because they remember when the European Union came into existence. So they remember the discussions in the 1970s. They remember the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, which officially brought it into being. And so they know it's just an institution. And they know that just as institutions can rise up, so they can also fall down. So they have a much more rational approach. I also think amongst young people it's become a slight kind of an element of virtue signalling. The way you show that you're a good person is by being pro-EU. That separates you out from stupid ordinary people. So it's become this kind of badge of honour that young people wear in a slightly thoughtless way, I think. So I think that's why youngsters are attached to it and are quite emotional about Britain leaving. Whereas for old people, they're just completely chilled out and they think, yeah, fine, we're going to leave this institution because we don't like it, which is a perfectly rational response. I think in relation to how do we bring people together, I'm not sure I want to do that at the moment because and there's a lot of talk at the moment about, Britain is obviously divided. There's, 16 million over here and 17.5 million over there, and how are we going to bring them together? And it becomes this slightly therapeutic discussion, which I'm worried is about burying the political tension. And I think political tensions need to be had out. And I think actually Brexit sprung from people's dislike of the fact that political tensions are being suppressed and divides are being suppressed and everything's being glossed over with this kind of technocracy. So I think it would be selling out Brexit if we now said, let's forget the differences and come together. I think there is going to be a period of tension and debate and conflict, hopefully not violent conflict, but kind of intellectual conflict. And I think that will be very healthy in terms of working out what Britain is for, what we want from our society. So I'm not in favour of unity at the moment. I think a bit of division, a bit of tension, some hard arguments, that's what we need.
I think it's really important that we talk about immigration and what Brexit means in terms of people who are living here, Europeans who don't have a status, British citizenship, that kind of thing. And also how we can rid the kind of racist association with Brexiteers and Brexit. I mean, what you were saying earlier about virtue signalling, it's completely true. I was talking to one of my friends and she said, I hate the European Union, I really don't like anything about it, but I could just never vote Brexit because I'm too worried about looking, like a racist. I want to be the right kind of person, I want to be this liberal, do-righter kind of thing. But I think and touching on what Fraser said as well about this rise in Donald Trumpism, and it relates to Brexit because people think there's a rise in racism, but I don't think people just become racist overnight. Those racist ideas are always there, and the EU can't take that away, but I think it's time that we have an important discussion, an open debate with people who are immigrants who don't have citizenship, and we need to make them feel like we don't want them to just disappear. They need to feel welcome. We do want them here. How can we do that without coming across as these racist, ignorant kind of people?
Every time that I've spoken about immigration in the context of Brexit and sort of pointed out that this is a really, really good opportunity for more free movement and for open borders to the whole world, everyone who is on the Remain side is extremely pessimistic about it, and they insist that Brexit was an anti-immigrant vote, and therefore in the future things will only get worse. How can we kind of turn that argument around and really point out that by having the arguments out in public in a way which we couldn't, how can we show that people can be convinced to embrace more freedom of movement and to embrace a more liberal approach to immigration?
It seems like one of the most powerful weapons in a political debate is calling someone a racist, and I think that the Remain campaign is very guilty of abusing the power of saying such a huge sweeping statement like that.
I'd just like to raise the point that I think it's actually more damaging to suggest that the country has somehow become racist and to give credence to kind of loner, bedroom-bound racists who might be inclined to go out and sort of say nasty things to people. I just think that is an awful thing for us to try or for people to suggest that that's what's happened, and in fact we should be challenging that and saying no, we're not a racist country. There weren't a huge number of racists before the vote, there aren't a huge number after the vote. Kicking down that argument and not allowing it to become a kind of identity politics thing where we can't say, I've been told I can't say that because I'm white, but we shouldn't be saying that. We should be saying this country isn't racist.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that linking Trump to the Brexit vote is out of order. My dad voted Brexit, so to say that is just ridiculous. I think that England, they do love migration, immigration, everything. I do worry a little bit though that there are a few that did vote with that in mind. That's unfortunate, but they do not speak for the whole of Britain.
Yeah, I think in relation to the question of bigotry and immigration, people on the Brexit side should not be defensive at all. We should actually go on the offensive, because if you want to see bigotry, you just need to look at the leaders of the Remain campaign. That's bigotry. The way they've been talking about the white working class, the way they've been talking about poor people, the way they've been talking about the North, and separating London off from the rest of the country and separating Scotland off so they can escape all these oiks and plebs and pig ignorant people as they see it. They've used the most repulsive Victorian language to describe these people. That's bigotry. If you look up the dictionary definition of bigotry, it's someone who is intolerant of all other points of view. It doesn't necessarily mean you're racist or sexist. It can mean that. The dictionary definition is that a bigot is someone who thinks that his point of view or his church or his way of life is the right one and everyone else's cannot be tolerated. That is the perfect description of the leaders of the Remain campaign. They are the bigots in this discussion in terms of the language they've been using and the things they've been saying. So I don't think we should accept that at all. And I also think we should challenge their idea that the EU is somehow a bastion of anti-racism and global brotherhood. whereas Brexiteers are all a bunch of racists and idiots. Because if you look at the European Union, actually it has a racist immigration policy. It allows freedom of movement, pretty much freedom of movement, for people who live within the European Union. So Poles can come to Britain and Brits can go to Germany and all that stuff. It's all very nice. But it doesn't allow freedom of movement from people outside of the EU. That's why thousands of people wash up on the shores of the Mediterranean, because they are not allowed in. So they have to sneak in. That's why the European Union and European Union member states have paid tyrannical regimes in Africa to keep their people at home rather than allowing them to come to Europe, because the EU doesn't want bad African people in Europe. That's a racist policy. It's a double standard. You can have freedom of movement if you're a European Union member, but not if you're outside of that. I remember shortly after Brexit, new statistics were revealed which showed that 2,888 people have died trying to get to the European Union this year so far. It will have gone up since then. That's a consequence of the institution that these people voted for. It actually has led to the deaths of non-white people. So I just don't accept, whenever they accuse Brexiteers of being racist and having a destructive impact on black and Asian people's lives, I just laugh in their faces, because that is so true of them and it's far less true of the Brexit camp. So I don't think we should be defensive about that at all. In fact, we should go on the offensive when they raise those kind of dodgy arguments. In relation to the immigration question more broadly, I think it's really interesting that immigration has become one of the means through which people express disgruntlement about their lives. I think that's really interesting. And I think that's a consequence of the fact that the liberal elite and the establishment and the European Union itself have weaponized immigration. They've turned immigration into a kind of social political weapon. If you read any EU document about immigration, they openly say immigration is a good way of weakening borders and reminding people that they now live in a globalized world. So they use it as a political tool. And people aren't stupid. They know that's happening. They know that immigration is being pushed in many ways because it's a way of undermining their sense of nationalism or national identity or community life and so on. And they react against that. So my favourite outcome is that we depoliticise immigration, don't allow it to be a political weapon, and argue instead for genuine freedom of movement, which is the right of people to travel around the world and to work in different places and to raise their families wherever they think is best. That's the kind of humanist argument we should be making, rather than using immigrants simply to get one over on native white working class people you don't like. Or having this kind of two-tiered approach as the EU does, which is that you can have free movement if you're a Polish builder, but not if you're an African guy who wants to come to Britain and work on a farm or something.
Brendan, what do you hope to get out of the Brexit negotiations on major issues such as politics, the economy, and our relationship with the EU and the rest of the world?
Brendan, I wanted to know about the future of the EU. What do you think will happen now? Would other nations also encourage their citizens to vote in a referendum and decide whether they want to stay in or out? Or do you think they will use Britain as an example? I personally feel everyone should be given the choice to decide whether they want to stay or not. But what do you think would happen?
I'd like to raise the issue of the Labour Party being bankrupt now, really, because Brexit was a really good thing to happen, because now we can see the politicians for who they really are. You know, they're disingenuous and they don't represent the people at all. So I think it was very good, Brexit.
I just want to know, is there anything we can take from history to help us kind of solve or muddle through this kind of political crisis that we've found ourselves in?
Yeah, I think in terms of history, there are various movements in history who have made the case very strongly for the right of people to consent to the institutions that govern them. And the whole problem with the European Union is that it was a whole set of institutions who governed us and made laws for us, but we didn't directly consent to them. So we need to learn from those people who made those arguments and from the bravery they had in taking on large parts of the establishment. And I think that's what we need to do now. We need to take on the establishment argument, which says that ordinary people aren't clever enough or sussed enough or progressive enough to do politics. I think in relation to what I want to happen to the EU, ultimately I want it to disappear and be destroyed and never come back. I think what the EU will do is it will simultaneously punish Britain. And you've seen openly supporters of the EU and some EU officials saying, well, the Brexit needs to be painful to send a message to other countries thinking about doing this. What it means is send a message to other people thinking about voting against the EU. So that I think they will be harsh on Britain as a kind of lesson to everyone else. But as it happens, Euroscepticism is growing across Europe. There are now Eurosceptic majorities in some European countries and significant minorities in others. In France, in Italy, in Spain, there are huge numbers of people who are anti-EU. And these are left-wing people, right-wing people, middle class, working class, students, a whole swathes of society. The new European unity, I think, will come through a collection of people who are against the oligarchy. That's the kind of solidarity and internationalism we now need to stoke up, I think. And in relation to what I want to happen in the future, the great thing about Brexit is that it throws all that in the air and nothing is definite. I don't think there are any roadmaps for the period we're in. I think this is a very unique historical period, which is that ordinary people, in a very quite polite, silent, slightly muted way, have rebelled against the establishment and said, we don't like your politics. And what they've ultimately said is we do think there's an alternative. The kind of governing principle of political life in the West for the past 30 years has been there is no alternative. This is the way things are. This is the way politics is. There's nothing different. And the EU really embodied that. And ordinary people have said, no, there is an alternative. The question for us now is, what do we want that alternative to look like? So I don't really have a blueprint as such. Obviously, I want economic prosperity and greater freedom and those kind of things, I think, which most people want. But I don't have a blueprint, and those questions are all now up for grabs. That's what I find exciting. On the Labour Party, I hope it's finished. I really hope it is. We can do this, guys. I'm against the Labour Party. I've always been against the Labour Party from a left-wing perspective, not from a right-wing perspective. I think the Labour Party is an albatross around the neck of progressive politics. It's like the Death Star of progressive politics. It sucks in all the energy of particularly young people who think that they're left and they're anti-Tory and they're progressive, and the Labour Party kind of sucks them in and kind of destroys their ambition and devours their souls. It's really not a very pleasant process. And the Labour Party's been like that for a long time. It's always sold out working class people and not met their ambitions and treated them pretty badly. But over the past 20 years, that's become really pronounced. It's gone from its original aim of representing working people's interests to wanting to remould and re-educate and change working class people and basically make them nice, thin, middle class people. That's now the mission of the Labour Party. It's extremely paternalistic and patronising and authoritarian. So I think any step forward for ordinary people, the kind of people who voted Brexit, the kind of people who want a new politics, who want something different to happen, the first step has got to be to hope that the Labour Party disappears as a significant player and that something else might take its place, a different idea, a different way of thinking, a different organisation. But anyone who wants change in Britain should not look to the Labour Party.
For me, one of the most exciting things about the referendum was this movement against technocracy. You know, although I'm excited about that, I am slightly nervous that a lot of the formal processes for leaving the European Union and a lot of the politics of the next decade is kind of going to look quite technocratic. Even a lot of the Leave campaign are now saying, oh, you know, hold your horses, there's a lot of complicated stuff here. How do we continue to fight against technocracy and make the case for democracy, putting the people in charge?
You're used to always hearing that like Brexit is like synonymous with like an ability to obviously like move freely. I was wondering what is actually our alternative for free movement as a result of Brexit, as opposed to like in spite of it, and how we can actually like amplify that as opposed to like see that as a how can we do that?
I noticed, especially from the Remain side, there was a lot of singling out particular demographics, and I think one particular victim was old people, and the main excuse against them was that, well, the old people who are voting to leave won't even suffer the choices of their decision 10 years later, which I personally think is a disgusting thing to say.
Michael, I disagree with you that old people are victims. I don't think they're sitting at home crying because no one else in society likes them. I think they're just as empowered by their vote, and that's what democracy is all about. So.
Yeah, I think there's been so much ageism in response to the Brexit vote. It's been really quite ugly, actually, and political conflict is taking a generational form. And you have all these young people and middle-aged people who think they're young attacking the old and saying they're stupid and they're racist and they're prejudiced and that's why they voted out. It's not true at all. And some of the arguments have been repulsive. You know, the idea, oh, you're only going to live another 10 years and therefore it doesn't matter how you vote, so it's all right for you. These really ugly arguments. And some people are openly saying people over 65 maybe shouldn't have the vote or should have less of a say than people who are, say, 25. So really calling into question the whole idea of universal suffrage and democracy itself. So some of that stuff's been really ugly. But I agree with you that I don't think old people are at home crying or anything like that. I think actually they probably just think those stupid young people. They're quite robust and they know what they chose and they know what they decided and they're pretty happy with it, I think. So I think they're okay, but I think it's still very important to challenge the kind of ageism that we've seen in response to the referendum result. I think in relation to how do you make the case for immigration and freedom of movement and so on as a Brexiteer, I've always thought my desire for Brexit has always been bound up with my belief in greater democracy and greater freedom, including freedom of movement. And so one of the reasons I dislike the European Union is because it is a fortress Europe. The reason it's called Fortress Europe is because it expels or keeps out non-white, non-European people. And what that means practically on a daily basis is that, there are a lot of Bangladeshis in Britain, for example. It's very difficult for their family members in Bangladesh to come and join them, or it can be very difficult. Whereas a young Romanian guy who has no family in Britain can come here very easily. My preferred outcome is that both of those people could move very easily. And so it's a two-tiered system. It has racial undertones. And so I've always wanted to leave the EU precisely because I believe in some of those freedoms and because I'm anti-racist and so on. So I think those arguments actually go together very well. If you look at how the European Union behaves, how it screws over Africa through its trade deals, which have completely pummeled lots of African industries, how it pays African regimes to keep their people out, how it kind of erects this invisible force field around the continent to keep African and Asian people out. All that stuff is really ugly. So I think those being a Brexiteer and being in favour of freedom actually go hand in hand very well. I think finally, in relation to the technocracy expertise question, this is, I think, one of the greatest things about Brexit, which it's called into question the whole new politics of expertise, which is this idea that there are really switched on clever people who've got PhDs and they understand the world and they should be trusted with making big political decisions. And then there are stupid people who read the Daily Mail or the Sun and speak in weird accents, and they shouldn't be trusted to make political decisions. That's the narrative that's coming from large sections of the Remain establishment. And I think we have to remind everyone how that's actually a very familiar argument. The argument that was made against universal male suffrage in the 1800s was that these people, these working men, had insufficient expertise to make political decisions. The argument that was made against female suffrage in the early 20th century is that these women lacked expertise. They weren't clever enough. They didn't know about military affairs and diplomatic affairs and economic affairs. So how could they be trusted to make a decision? That argument is as old as democracy itself. And so it's coming back. And I think we need to remind people of the ugly snobbery that motivates it. And finally, I think what's really important is to take the spirit of the Chartists, because the Chartists, that working class movement for democracy, when people said to them, working people aren't as good at doing politics as clever people, their response was to say, not just to say, well, they might be, let's give them a chance. Their response was to say, actually, we think they are better. And we think they are better because they are in society, they are working in it, they understand it in a way that you experts and aristocrats and lords and so on don't understand it. And that, I think, is the argument we need going ahead post-Brexit. We need to say not only that working class people and ordinary people are just as good at making political decisions as experts, but they are better. They are better because they are in society, they understand it in a way that these aloof elitists don't, and they must be trusted completely to determine the shape of their society.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank our special guest, Brendan O'Neill, and our volunteers. If you'd like to take part in the next edition of Don't Shout at the Telly, please email us.